Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something right now. Family will test you in ways strangers never could. The closer the blood, the deeper the cut. And when Auntie May tells a story, you know it is gonna come with lessons deep in truth and sprinkled with a little attitude. Today I am gonna tell you about the day our own son locked us in the basement and the secret my husband whispered that changed everything. Grab a seat because this one, oh honey, this one is a ride. Betrayal does not always show itself with shouting or broken dishes or slammed doors. Sometimes betrayal slips into the room quietly like it belongs there and pretends everything is normal until you blink twice and realize the ground beneath your feet has shifted. That night when our own son locked us in the basement, the silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been. It pressed against my chest like a weight I could not push off. It is one thing to be hurt by the world outside. It is another thing entirely to be wounded by the one you carried, the one you fed, and the one you believed would one day watch over you when your strength ran thin. When the lock clicked shut, it sounded soft, yet the meaning behind it hit hard. My first thought was confusion. Surely this was a mistake. Surely he would open the door in a second and laugh and say he was only playing. But the seconds kept passing and the door stayed shut. My heart began to pound in a slow, heavy rhythm as awareness crept up my spine. Awareness that the child you raise is not always the adult you meet later in life. Awareness that love does not prevent people from making choices that cut deep. Awareness that parenthood does not come with a guarantee that the devotion you poured into someone will come back in the same form. My husband stood next to me without saying a word. His silence was steadier than mine. His breath stayed even. His posture stayed calm. The only thing that moved was his eyes, and those eyes spoke volumes. They held disappointment. They held pain. They held something ancient and weary. Fathers carry a different kind of heartbreak. Mothers feel the wound in the heart. Fathers feel it in the soul. The silence between us grew thick as molasses as the truth settled like dust in a room that has not been touched in years. There is a special kind of pain that comes from realizing your own child believes you are an obstacle instead of a blessing. A pain that does not scream. A pain that does not throw fits. It simply settles inside you and echoes until it becomes a hollow space where trust once lived. I felt that space forming in me that night. Each second in that basement stretched into a rope wrapped around my chest. I could feel the shock in every breath. Yet even though the pain was sharp, I stayed quiet because sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps you from falling apart. Silence can be a mirror. It shows you what words try to hide. In the silence I saw flashes of my son as a child. I saw him running through the yard with scraped knees. I saw him tugging on my shirt asking for snacks. I saw him crying during rainstorms and climbing into my lap. I saw myself standing beside him through heartbreaks, disappointments, school troubles, and bad decisions. Every memory flickered across my mind like old film spinning through a dusty projector. And in that moment the hardest truth hit me. All the years of love and labor do not guarantee the outcome you expect. Parenting does not work like a puzzle where pieces fit neatly into place. Parenting is a deck of cards you shuffle with hope and prayer, and some days life deals you a hand you never expected. My husband reached for my hand in the dark. His touch was warm, steady, and reassuring. No words, just presence. And that presence spoke louder than any lecture. Our marriage had been through storms before, yet this was a storm we never imagined we would face. Our own child treating us like strangers. As if we were people he needed to contain rather than protect. The betrayal in his action was louder than any argument he could have thrown at us. It was a betrayal that did not even need sound. It announced itself through the heavy quiet that filled the room. I closed my eyes and listened. Not to the house but to my own spirit. Betrayal has a sound. It is the sound of hope cracking. It is the sound of trust crumbling. It is the sound of love bending under weight it should never have carried. And in that basement I heard that sound loud and clear even though the room was silent. That is the thing about betrayal. It blooms in silence. It thrives in stillness. It does not need noise to make itself known. It speaks through absence, through the space where love should be, through the hollow spot where care used to sit. I tried to understand what drove our son to this point. People change. Life twists them in ways you do not always see. Sometimes they fall under the influence of the wrong people. Sometimes they chase after power or control. Sometimes fear drives them to foolish choices. And sometimes they simply forget the hands that raised them. But none of those reasons soften the blow of betrayal. A reason is not a remedy. It does not erase the hurt. It does not erase the shock of hearing a lock click on the other side of a door that your own child controls. The silence inside that basement also revealed something else. It revealed the distance that had been quietly growing in our home. Sometimes the signs are there yet too small to name. A clipped tone, a cold glance, a conversation cut short, a door closed too firmly, a lingering sense that something is shifting. You brush it off. You say life is stressful. You say work is hard. You say he is just tired. But denial is the soft blanket people wrap around uncomfortable truths. And when the lock turned that night, the blanket fell away and the truth stood tall in the room. Our son had been drifting far from the values we placed in him. The silence also taught me something about myself. I realized that love is not blind, but it can be stubborn. Love insists that the people you raised must still hold the goodness you planted in them even when their behavior shows otherwise. Love keeps believing, keep hoping, keep excusing until the day reality walks up and taps you on the shoulder. That night reality tapped hard, yet the silence did not break me. Instead it pushed me into a deeper strength I did not know I still had. Strength that comes from surviving disappointments. Strength that comes from years of hardship. Strength that comes from knowing who you are even when others forget. I stood in that basement not as a defeated mother but as a woman who had lived enough life to know that betrayal does not end the story. It simply turns the page. When I looked at my husband I could see the same truth settling in him. The silence did not weaken him. It sharpened him. It woke something inside him that had been resting for years. The silence allowed him to listen to his instincts and not his fear. And later when he said he had a secret, I understood why he wanted me to stay quiet. Silence can protect you. It can give you time to think. It can hold space for clarity. It can keep panic from becoming chaos. But before any escape plan, before any whisper, before any strategy, silence gave you something more important. It gave you the chance to face the truth of what our son had done. It forced you to look betrayal in the face without running. It forced you to accept that the child we loved had chosen a path that hurt you. And acceptance, no matter how painful, is the first step in reclaiming power. So yes, the silence was loud. It thundered without making a sound. It broke our hearts without breaking the air. Yet in that silence we learned who we were and who we were not. We were not weak. We were not powerless. We were not victims. We were hurt yet not destroyed. Silence showed you that betrayal can wound you, but it does not get the final say. We do. When that boy of mine stormed out of the basement door and slammed it behind him, I felt something inside me crack in a way I had never known before. A mother spends her life thinking she can sense every shadow that passes over her child, yet there I was standing in a cold basement staring at a locked door and wondering how in the world my own son had grown into a man who could look me in the eye and still choose to shut me behind a wall like I was some burden he needed to hide. I felt my knees weaken, but pride held me up because a mother learns early that she must stand even when her heart wants to fall flat on the floor. The silence down there stretched itself across the room like an old heavy blanket, and every second felt like it was trying to smother what little hope I had left. My husband stood beside me, steady as a tree that has survived every storm in the county. His presence calmed me though my mind raced with every awful thought. I kept hearing my son's voice shouting words that did not sound like him. Words filled with anger, bitterness, and a strange hardness that I had never heard from him growing up. I thought of the little boy who used to slip his small hand into mine every time a loud dog barked or thunder rolled across the sky. Sometimes I think life takes our sons and daughters and places a stone in their pockets, and before long the weight pulls them into places where love cannot breathe clean air. I walked around the room trying to understand where all this had gone wrong. There were old boxes from years we had nearly forgotten, kids' school projects, a rusted tricycle, an old lamp that never worked right. It felt like the ghosts of our own family history were huddled around us watching to see whether we would crumble. My husband leaned against a shelf and never took his eyes off me. He knew I was carrying a pain heavier than any object down there. A mother's heart does not break easily, but once the crack appears it spreads like a quiet fire. I tried to replay the last few months in my mind. The arguments, the tension, the small moments when something felt off. He had grown distant, cold even. He blamed us for things we did not understand. He shouted at his father more than at me, but even his silence toward me felt sharp enough to cut. I had chalked it up to stress or frustration or maybe life weighing down on him in a way he did not know how to handle. But never once did I imagine he would take such a step. To lock us away. As if we were a problem. As if we were in the way. As if we were strangers who had stumbled into his home uninvited. The basement air felt thick, heavy enough that I had to breathe slow to keep my chest from tightening. I pressed my ear to the door listening for footsteps. Nothing, no movement, no shift, only the stillness of a house that suddenly did not feel like mine. I felt an ache deep inside that had nothing to do with fear. It was grief, not grief for my life, not grief for safety, but grief for the son who once knew what respect tasted like. The son who used to bring me wildflowers from the field behind the school. The son who used to beg for one more story before bed. I turned toward my husband with tears burning but not falling because I refused to let heartbreak win. He gave me a small nod. A quiet gesture. A kind of strength only a long marriage can build. He had lived through loss and hardship and betrayal, and he knew how to stand still and let the truth wash over him until it settled into something he could carry. I felt my chest loosen just a hair watching him. Then the fear crept in again. What if he did not want us here anymore? What if he had plans that would hurt us more? What if we had raised a stranger instead of a son? My mind spun with every question a mother never wants to ask. I pressed my palms against the cold wall to steady myself. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer that felt older than my own years. A plea for strength, wisdom, and courage. In that moment something inside me shifted. I was no longer just a mother lost in a storm. I became a woman ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant confronting the truth that my son had become someone I no longer recognized. Pain can crush you or carve you. I chose to let it carve me into someone who would not be cowed by fear or guilt. My husband stepped closer and touched my arm gently. It was then that he leaned in and whispered that low steady whisper of his, telling me that everything was not as hopeless as it seemed. That he had a plan. That he had a secret. Those words lit a tiny spark inside me. A spark that pushed back the dark just enough for me to breathe again. That moment did not erase the hurt. It did not mend the wound. But it gave me something to hold on to. A small thread of faith woven through the wreckage of the situation. And sometimes that is all a person needs to keep standing. A thread. A whisper. A reminder that even in the deepest night there is a light waiting somewhere just out of sight. When my husband leaned close with that whisper only I could hear, it was like time paused inside that dim basement. The air felt still enough to touch. I could see the seriousness settle in his eyes, and I knew right then that he had been thinking 3 steps ahead long before I even noticed something was wrong. That man of mine had always carried quiet wisdom, the kind you would miss if you were not paying attention. And when he whispered that he had a secret, something inside my chest loosened like a knot finally easing apart. It was not relief exactly, but it was the promise that we were not powerless, and that meant everything in that moment. He stepped back and took a slow breath, and his voice, low and steady, filled the space in a way that made me forget the wall strap on us. He said he had known for weeks that our son's temper had been building. He had seen the shifts in behavior, the long silences, the late nights, the clipped answers that did not match the boy we raised. He had noticed the way our son avoided looking us in the eyes, and how his shoulders stayed tight like he was wrestling with something he did not want to admit. My husband had kept his eyes open and his instincts sharp because he knew something was coming, even if he did not yet know what shape it would take. I remember sinking down onto an old wooden stool as he spoke. Dust floated in thin ribbons through the air, catching the faint light from the tiny window near the ceiling. It felt almost like the whole basement leaned in to listen. My husband told me he had prepared for the possibility that our son might lash out in a way neither of us saw coming. He had hoped he was wrong. He had prayed he was wrong. But he had still taken precautions because life had taught him that you never ignore the quiet signs. Especially not when someone you love is wrestling with anger that has no place to go. He reached behind one of the old paint cans and pulled out a small metal box that I had not noticed before. It was one of those weathered things that looked like it had lived through several generations of secrets. He placed it on the table between us, and his eyes held mine with that same calm strength he had shown on the hardest days of our marriage. He told me that inside the box was something he had hoped we would never need. Something he had hidden away only after he saw the shift in our son's behavior. My breath caught as he lifted the lid because for a moment I did not know what I would say. He pulled out a small flashlight, then a set of spare keys, then a phone I had forgotten we ever owned. He explained in that slow, patient way of his that he had hidden the old phone down here weeks ago because he suspected our son would eventually shut off our access to communication. He had charged it, kept it active, and tucked it away like a man preparing for a storm that others thought would never come. When he placed it in my hands, I felt a wave of gratitude so deep it shook me. I held that phone like it was a lifeline because in many ways it was. He said he also had put copies of our house keys down here long before today because he knew our son might try to control the space in ways he should never have dared. I looked at my husband and I saw not just the man I married but the protector he had always been. A man who watched over his family even when no one saw it. A man who planned for the unthinkable not out of fear but out of love. I felt my eyes sting and I fought back the tears because crying would have made me feel weaker than I wanted to be in that moment. Instead I nodded and held the phone close while he kept speaking. He told me that the secret he whispered about was not just the items in the box. It was a deeper truth. He had been gathering information about our son's recent behavior, checking financial statements, watching where he went, listening to the tone of his voice when he spoke about the house, about us, about control. He said he had found things that worried him, bank withdrawals that made no sense. Conversations our son had been having with people neither of us knew. And the most chilling detail of all, he believed our son had been planning to take the house from under us and push us aside like old furniture. My stomach twisted at his words because that level of betrayal is something no parent should ever have to imagine. Yet my husband stood steady. He said he had already spoken to a lawyer. Quietly, privately, without causing a single ripple. He had made sure our names and rights were protected. He had secured everything that mattered. Money, deeds, legal standing. Every thread that could unravel had been tied tight before things reached this point. Hearing that nearly brought me to my knees. I felt the weight of helplessness slide off my shoulders little by little as he continued explaining how each step had been arranged to ensure our safety long Before our son ever turned that lock, he told me that the lawyer knew we might call, that the moment we stepped out of that basement there would be paperwork ready to stop our son from making any reckless decisions. And that meant this situation did not have the power to break us even if it tried. I stared at the man I married all those years ago and I felt a rush of pride so strong I could taste it. He had saved us before the danger even found its way through the front door. It was then that he stepped close again and placed his hand on my shoulder with a steady grip. He told me we needed to stay calm. That panic would do nothing but cloud our judgment. That fear would only feed the power our son thought he had over us. He said we had to move carefully and think clearly because today was not simply a moment of crisis. It was a turning point, a line that had been crossed, and once crossed it could never be uncrossed. We stood together in that dim room and for the first time since the door shut I felt the ground under my feet return. I felt strength rising where fear had been sitting. I felt the kind of courage that comes only when you realize that even in the worst moment you are not alone. My husband looked at me and I saw in his face the truth he had known all along. That we were going to walk out of that basement not as victims but as people who understood exactly what needed to happen next. And if our son thought locking us away was the end of the story he was deeply mistaken. Because that secret my husband held was not only a plan. It was a promise that we were stronger, wiser and far more prepared than he ever imagined. And that realization was the beginning of a shift so powerful it would change everything that came after. The moment my husband finished sharing that secret the basement did not feel so dark anymore. It was as if the air shifted giving us a little room to breathe again. I stood up slowly feeling strength crawl back into my bones like a long-lost friend returning home. The walls around us were still the same and the locked door had not magically opened but something inside me had changed. I was no longer a mother trembling with fear. I was a woman gathering her power piece by piece the way you gather kindling before a fire. And I planned to burn through the shadows that had settled over my family. My husband walked to the far end of the basement and began searching through the shelves with purpose. He knew what he was looking for. I could tell by the steady way his hands moved across old dusty boxes and forgotten household tools. He finally found what he wanted. A sturdy iron bar that had once been part of an old storage rack. He lifted it with his and I could see the determination settle deeper into his posture. That man was ready. Not to fight in a reckless way, not to lash out, but to protect, to break through whatever barrier stood between us and our freedom. I watched him and something inside me rose like a tide. My fear took a step back to make room for a wave of resolve. All at once I knew we were not the helpless trapped parents our son believed us to be. We were adults who had survived storms he could not even name. We were people who had weathered hardships that would have flattened weaker souls. The basement walls did not define us. His locked door did not control us. And the silence above our heads did not mean defeat. It only meant we needed to choose our next move with precision. My husband returned to me and placed the iron bar gently against the table. Then he looked into my eyes with that same steady warmth that had carried me through more trials than I could count. He told me we needed to wait. Not long, just until we were sure the house was still quiet. He listened closely for any sign of movement upstairs. I could see the concentration in his face, the way he tilted his head slightly, the way he held his breath just enough to let the world speak to him. When he finally nodded I knew the moment had come. He picked up the iron bar again and walked to the door with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I followed behind, standing just close enough to feel his presence. The basement door was thick old wood, solid but not invincible. My husband pressed his ear to the surface for one more check. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No sign our son was near. It was strange how the silence that had terrified me minutes earlier now felt like a blessing. My husband adjusted his grip and raised the bar slightly, testing the weight. Before he made the first strike, he turned to me one more time. His eyes asked me if I was ready. I nodded without hesitation. A strange courage had settled into my chest, and it was not the loud kind. It was quiet, steady, unshakable. The kind of strength that reminded me of every year we had built our life together, brick by brick, choice by choice, heartbreak by heartbreak, triumph by triumph. With that unspoken understanding between us, my husband swung the bar with a controlled force. The sound echoed like thunder in the confined space. A sharp crack. A deep groan from the wood. Dust drifted from the frame. The lock held, but I saw it shudder under the pressure. My heart raced, but not with fear. With momentum. With the knowledge that the door would not win. My husband lifted the bar again and struck once more. Another crack. Another shift in the wood. A splintered edge appeared near the latch. Each blow was both a physical impact and an emotional release. A testament to the truth that no lock could hold a determined soul. I stepped closer and placed my hand on his back, grounding both of us. He did not need my help with the bar, but he needed to know he was not standing alone. Together we had survived too much to let a locked basement door break us now. He swung again, and this time the wood split enough that light bled through the crack. A thin sliver, but enough to tell us we were seconds from freedom. My pulse quickened and I held my breath, waiting for the next strike. He took one last swing with a controlled strength that came from years of necessity, not anger. The lock tore free and the door burst open with a sharp release that echoed up the stairwell. Light from the hallway spilled into the basement like dawn, pushing away the night. For the first time since the door had shut behind us, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. We stepped into the hallway with the caution of people who had been forced to question everything. The house was still quiet, oddly quiet, and that made the moment heavier. My husband motioned for me to stand behind him while he moved forward, checking each corner, each doorway, each shadowed space. I followed him up into the living room, and the sight that greeted us was both familiar and foreign. Our own home felt different in a way that made my stomach twist. The furniture Saturday where it always had, yet there was an emptiness in the air. A hollowness left behind by the betrayal of someone who once brought laughter into these very rooms. I felt the ache of it spread through me slowly. A soft, deep hurt that could not be shaken off. My husband placed a hand on my arm, grounding me again. It was a gesture he had made thousands of times over the years, and still it held the same power. We moved carefully through the house. Every step deliberate, every sound measured, but our son was nowhere in sight. The more rooms we checked, the more unsettling the silence became. My husband reached for the phone he had given me earlier and handed it back to me with a steady nod. It was time to make the calls he had prepared me for. Time to take control of what had once felt hopeless. Time to turn fear into action. As I pressed the buttons and waited for the lawyer to answer, I watched my husband stand near the window, looking out with a calm that came from knowing he had acted wisely long before crisis arrived. His foresight had saved us. His quiet strength had lifted me. His secret had given us the tools we needed to rise again. And even though the situation was far from over, I felt a powerful certainty settle into my bones. We had broken out of the basement. We had reclaimed our freedom. And we were ready for whatever came next. Not with fear, not with trembling, but with the unshakable truth that no door, no lock, and no betrayal could ever defeat the united strength of two people who had spent a lifetime learning how to survive together. When I ended that call with the lawyer, my hands trembled only slightly, not from fear but from the weight of everything that was shifting around us. The house felt different now, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what we would do next. I turned and saw my husband still standing near the window, his posture firm and steady like an oak that had seen far too many storms to be shaken by one more. I walked toward him, drawn by the quiet strength that radiated from his presence. He looked out across the yard with narrowed eyes, searching the driveway, the street, the horizon for any sign of our son. But the world outside remained still. There is a special kind of silence that settles over a home after a betrayal. It is not the peaceful kind that curls around you at dawn. It is heavier, like a blanket soaked in cold water pressing down on your chest. It is the silence that makes you rethink everything you once thought unshakable. I felt that silence deep in my bones. I could hear my own heartbeat loud in my ears, marking time while I waited for the next step to unfold. My husband finally turned toward me and I saw the resolve in his eyes. A resolve shaped by years of fatherhood, years of responsibility, years of knowing how to protect his family from hurt, even when the hurt came from someone he loved more than his own breath. He stepped closer and placed his hands gently on my shoulders. His touch was warm, familiar, grounding. He told me we needed to prepare ourselves for the conversation that was coming. Not a simple discussion, not a calm talk at the dinner table. It would be something far heavier. A confrontation shaped by truth and consequence. I nodded slowly, letting his words sink into the deepest part of me. Parenting had never been easy, and we had weathered our share of challenges with our son through childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. Yet nothing had prepared us for this. It is one thing to guide a child through mistakes born of innocence and inexperience. It is another to face a grown man who had made choices rooted in anger, control, and recklessness. The line between love and accountability had never felt so sharp. We stood in the center of the living room, scanning the space as if studying the battlefield before the clash. It felt dramatic to think of it that way, but motherhood teaches you to recognize the moments when the ground beneath you shifts and you either stand firm or fall hard. My husband asked me if I was ready. I answered yes, but deep inside I knew readiness was not a feeling. It was a choice. And I chose to be ready because there was no other path. We moved through the house, checking doors, locking windows, securing every entry point with the quiet precision of two people who understood that protection was necessary, not from the outside world but from someone we had raised within our own walls. The weight of that truth pressed against my chest, yet it also fueled my determination. Once the house was secured, we returned to the living room. My husband took a deep breath and told me it was time to gather every piece of strength we had ever carried. Because what was coming next was not just a confrontation. It was the moment our family would either break or begin to heal. He said we needed to be clear, steady, and unwavering. No anger, no shouting, just firm, unshakable boundaries shaped by truth. He walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a small metal safe I had not realized he kept there. When he opened it, I saw documents, deeds, insurance papers, and a series of envelopes with our names written in his neat handwriting. Each envelope held information he had gathered over the months. Financial details, copies of suspicious transactions, notes on conversations he had overheard, evidence of the storm our son had been creating long before today. My heart twisted with grief as I looked at the papers. This was the life our son had been living behind our backs. Desperation masked as independence, anger masked as ambition, poor decisions masked as strength. The evidence told a story no parent wants to read, yet there it was, laid out like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to assemble. My husband placed a hand on mine and told me we were not responsible for the choices our grown child had made. That we had given him everything we could give. Love, guidance, opportunity, stability, and at some point he had chosen a different path. A darker path. And while we could stand at the crossroads and offer him a map, we could not walk the road for him. His words settled inside me like a stone sinking through deep water. Heavy yet grounding. I took a deep breath and felt something shift inside me. A kind of acceptance. Not the kind that surrenders. The kind that stands firm. I looked around our home, remembering birthdays, holidays, laughter, arguments, reconciliations, and every ordinary day that had filled our life together. This house was more than walls and windows. It was a container for every memory that shaped us. And no matter what our son had tried to do, we were not about to surrender it. My husband folded the documents and placed them back in the safe, then closed it with a firm click that echoed like a promise. He said that when our son returned we would sit him down and face the truth together. Even if the truth cut deep. Even if it broke his pride or shattered the image he had tried to project. Because truth is the only thing strong enough to rebuild something that has fallen apart. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steadier than before. I watched the sunlight catch the edge of the glass and scatter across the counter. Something about that simple shimmer felt hopeful. A small reminder that even in the darkest moments light finds its way to the surface. As I sipped the water, I heard my husband moving through the house again, checking locks, checking doors, checking windows. It was not fear guiding him. It was preparedness. It was the instinct of a man who knew that the next few hours would change our lives. And he wanted to make sure we stood ready. I walked back toward him and slipped my hand into his. His grip tightened around mine, strong, warm, and reassuring. Together we stood near the front door waiting. Not with dread, not with panic, with resolve. A resolve built from decades of partnership and shared battles. Outside, the world remained quiet. Inside, our hearts beat steady and strong as we prepared to face the son we loved and the truth he needed to hear.